Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We are starting now at 2 o'clock. We have today with us Pieter Passchyn. He will introduce himself just in 1 minute. But before that, I will do a short intro about the platform and what you can see and how you can work with it if you have questions for Pieter. So if you have any questions, you can send it during the webinar. Just write it down under questions and send it, and we will receive it. And okay, somebody said that there's no sound. Can you please? You have a button. You see on the screen. You have a button on the toolbar. You have for GoToWebinar to raise your hand. So I will kindly ask you to raise your hand if you can hear me well, please. Okay. Okay, good. So if you have questions, you can send it in the chat under questions in the toolbar from GoToWebinar that you can see on your screen, and we'll receive it. All questions will be answered at the end, okay? We will read them out loud, and Pieter will answer your question at the end of the session. If you want your microphone to be switched on because you are all muted right now, you can raise your hand, and we will do this at the end of the session again, okay? During the question and answers. And if you have problems with your audio, which I think any of you have right now because most of you have raised the hand, you can check the audio under the window that says audio in your toolbar of GoToWebinar. And please remember, we have prepared a short survey. Is 5 or 6 questions, but just that, it's just 1 minute replying to that to give us some feedback about the session and if you like it or not, and well, anything else. So before starting, we will present ourselves. Hosting from UNIFORM-Agri side, there are both of us, is Jan de Pestel from UNIFORM-Agri Belgium team, and me myself, Almudena Molinero. I'm from Spain, and today we have as presenter Pieter Passchyn, who is veterinarian and nutritionist in Kpis, Belgium. So Pieter, if you want to present yourself.
Thank you. I hope you can you all hear me. I am Pieter Passchyn. I'm a veterinarian by education, did 10 years of practice in Ghent University, and after my 10 years of practical work in Belgium, I started my own consultancy work on as milk advisor in Belgium. But I will talk to you later. I have a small slide on it to explain what we do in the next few slides. So now I will try to share my screen.
Yeah, just 1 moment. Okay, let's go. I will change presenter. And now, Pieter, you are now presenter, so you can start sharing.
Yeah. Okay, I hope you can see the first slide. Is it okay?
I will switch off my camera also. Okay. Now we can see your PowerPoint perfectly.
Okay, excellent. So let's start this afternoon. First of all, thank you for asking me to talk a little bit on how I use UNIFORM-Agri, the consultant version. We'll talk this afternoon a little bit on troubleshooting dairy farms using the program, and also some theoretical things hopefully to help you to give a better interpretation in data and in data analytics. So it will be a little bit on all aspects on a dairy farm, especially fertility, milk production and health, metabolic diseases, other health. So it will be some kind of, yeah, all data mixed up together. So to give a brief overview, we're going to start with a small introduction. Then I'm going to talk about some quite theoretical things on fertility and herd health management, but it will be short. Then we talk about KPIs, so key performance indicators, which one to use, what to know, what kind of KPIs do we have and can we use. And to go further, we're going to talk about in using data, you have to learn what kind of pitfalls you will have or you can have in the data interpretation or per KPI. It can be there are some pitfalls, and so try to make you aware of some things if you analyzing the data on the farm. Small introduction already said something. So we work as independent consultants, which means that we don't sell any product on a farm, we don't sell any medicines, any feed or feed additives. We only invoicing actually our hours worked on a farm. Our goal on a farm, together with the farmer, of course, is to achieve fertile cows which are producing healthy milk with a high quality. And I think saying that you cover the whole health and most of the goals you can have on a dairy farm. Our focus is mainly reproduction, and if you talk about reproduction, then you also talk, of course, about ration and feed management, transition, dry cow, ration, dry cow management. That's I think the main part of our work that we do. And of course, if you want healthy milk and with a high quality, you also have to focus on milk quality and animal health, of which metabolic diseases and other health are the most important aspects. The way we work in Belgium, you have to know that in Belgium farms are not that big. We are on average, our client is about 100 cows. But still, there's quite a variation and also a big variation in the goals of a farmer. And that's why we try to work in a more customized way. So we have some farms that we go there every 2 weeks, but also we have farms depending on how big the farm is, but also especially the goal of the farmer, that we go there only every 2 or 3 months. And of course, we won't do any reproduction work every 2 months. That will be a little bit too late, but focusing then on that kind of farms is mainly ration and feed management. So it depends largely between farmers, how we work on that farm. I have a small poll here, so I hope Anu can take the slide over. I have a small poll of which I want to know on which kind of farms you work on, and it would be just to have an idea from me. You can click on the button. Most of the farms you work on are mainly beneath 80 cows, or maybe between 80 cows and 200 cows, or a little bit higher, between 200 and 500 cows, or even if you mainly work on the big herds. In my opinion, above 500 cows are big herds. So just to give an idea, what is the audience? Because of course I can't see you. I don't know on which kind of farms you work on.
Yeah, people are replying. We have almost 70% of the audience have replied. So let's wait a little bit and see the final result. Oops, sorry, there's a mistake. First option is less than 80 milking cows, not less than 8. Sorry for that, it's a typo.
Nevertheless, I'm still interested in the guy that does herd health management on farms less than 8 cows.
Yeah.
Never know.
Okay, so 81% of the audience have voted, and from all of them, 63%, so most of them replied between 80 and 200 cows. 27 between 200 and 500, and 10% work with farms with more than 500 cows.
Okay. Thank you. So that's interesting also for me, of course. Here in Belgium, we also work, on average, herd size is about 100 cows, and I think our clients, 80% of our clients are between 80 and 200 cows. Some are above a little bit, 200, 300, but we don't have a lot of cows a lot of herds with more than 500 cows. So it will be good, I think, also for later in the presentation that we focus a little bit on those groups because it's also important in the data interpretation. I said some theoretical part. I will go over those slides quite fast because I think it should be known. That's one thing, and on the other hand, it's not the scope of this afternoon. But if you work as a consultant on dairy farms, you have to. It's good that you have in your mind the management cycle, which I think you have to start on farms with knowing goals and the motivation and the mindset of the farmer. And so you have to know where the farmer want to go to. After that, you can try to collect data to make an analysis on the farm. After that, you go to the third party, formulate a management plan, the things you want to improve, and you also always need a monitoring system as a follow-up and as an evaluation tool. So talking about goals and motivation, it will depend. I think it's really important that you have good communication skills, and I think good consultants, they are good consultants because they can communicate really good. It also depends on what kind of visit do you do. Are there herd visits that you only go there once as a troubleshooter? Then it's more, it's not that easy to get behind the motivation and the mindset of the farmer because you don't know the farmer that well, I presume. It's something different if you talk about, if you go there every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks to a farmer, then by learning him, by working with him, it's more easy to get out of his motivation. So what I learned in those years, I was as a consultant, I think it's very interesting and very useful that you ask a lot of questions and you don't talk too much. And in that case, the Dalai Lama was very right in the saying. So if you talk too much, and we as consultants, I think we have always the need to talk, to explain, to give scientific explanation for something within the beginning. In herd health visits or in visits as a nutritionist or as a veterinarian, you still have to ask a lot and you have to learn a lot. It's just only by listening to the farmer, to the herdsman, that you get some extra information. So keep in mind that this is very needed. Also, further on communication skills, if you give advice to your farmer, make it as easy as possible and don't make a difficult construction. If you give an advice, make it simple, make it smart, which means that has to be, any advice you give has to be specific, has to be measurable, it also has to be attainable. And it has to be relevant, of course, and that's quite logic, and timely. So it's important to keep that in mind. I will not cover the whole thing on this, but sometimes it's better to give an advice that is maybe not scientifically the best way to do, but as long as you know that you will get the farmer into this program, get the farmer changing his habits, I think it's more important to start with it, even if it's not 100% scientifically the best way to do. Further on, by learning them, by having trust, gaining trust, it will help you, of course, to work on. As said, so after communication skills, you have to translate actually goals and not the motivation, especially the goals. You have to translate it into the data, and you do that, of course, by using the data collection and saying that you have to address that it's important that you don't forget the individual cow. Even if we are looking on herd health management, you have to be aware that even the variation in milk production and herd health between animals on the same farm is actually bigger than the variation in milk production and herd health between farms. So you only achieve a good herd results. It's always the together, the individual cows together, that will make the herd result. You only achieve a high milk production because you don't have a lot of cows that gave not enough milk, or only 20 liters of milk, for example. It's every cow is still important, even on the bigger herds, even especially, of course, on small herds is every cow important, but also to have a good herd result on a 500 cow herd, the individual cow is still important. So keep that in mind, and always if you look at figures, at KPIs, it's always a sum or the average or a calculation of all individual cows together. So don't forget it. If we formulate the plan, of course, you have to look for some KPIs, some key performance indicators, and if you want to do that, we could build a whole dashboard, a whole cockpit to run the farm, and you should be aware, and there's a lot of possibilities, and there are different systems. Even on UNIFORM-Agri, there are a lot of KPIs that you could use. So you have to be aware which KPIs do you use and why do you use them. And you also have to think quite logically and focus on only those KPIs that are useful, and think in a logical way on a farm, because if you don't do that, you don't see all the simple problems that will come up to you. If you're only focusing on a lot of KPIs, setting them right, you won't see the big problem that is heading towards you. So be careful in using too many KPIs on a farm. And of course, and that we'll cover up later, the pitfalls you can have using every KPI. I will talk to it later. So still I have another poll. So Anu, I think you could take the screen and do a quick poll to the participants. So it would be interesting for me to know, working on a herd, if you look at the reproduction, what is for you the most important KPI to evaluate reproduction on a farm? Is it the calving interval you use? Do you mainly use pregnancy rates or only conception rates, or do you look at the conception rate at first service? So it would be interesting to share that opinion with us. Almo, do we have already some answers? So here we have the results. So I'm glad to see it actually, because there are not a lot of people that use calving interval as a KPI. It can be a KPI, of course, it is a KPI, but it's probably not the best thing to do. Yet 60% are using a pregnancy rate, which actually is the multiplication of the insemination rate with the conception rate. Concept rate is also used, but only by 6% of the participants. And there are also quite a lot of people that are using concept rate at first service, 24%. I will not say which one is the best, it will depend. I think in general, we can say that calving interval is not a good KPI to evaluate reproduction. And on the other three, you can discuss a little bit. The pregnancy rate, of course, takes the two, takes insemination rate and conception rate, but also concept rate at first service if you want to evaluate in a more quick way, it can tell you something on the farm. So thank you for this answer. Now we're going to talk about a little bit more on those key performance indicators. If you go to the dashboard of UNIFORM-Agri, the consultant version, there you can see there are quite a lot of KPIs you could choose. You could choose on different key performance indicators. You could put them in a graph, or you could put it as a figure. It's also interesting if you go to the right side, you could click on a button where there's a new window that pops out. And then you can see you can choose actually more or other KPIs to work. I think it's always interesting if you go to a farm, the first time of course, but even later, it's always good to discuss these KPIs with the farmer, because sometimes his goal is not really shown in the KPI which is active on the probe. You also have to be aware that on some KPIs, for example, somatic cell count, it will take the average somatic cell count of the last milk control, and the one which is marked a little bit smaller is actually the milk control before the last one, and that's actually the same. If you look at SPP, I'll talk to it later. There's standard peak production. If you look at the expected calving interval, here it is mentioned in red. You could choose those colors, good or bad. You could put them as a goal interesting to work on and to discuss with the farmer. Only should be aware that the expected calving interval is always the one of the last month. Cows that are inseminated and pregnant the last month, and the other one is the month before. So it depends a little bit on the KPI. How do you work with it? So it's interesting. It's what I wanted to say, to share this with your farmer and to discuss every KPI. Also, in discussing these things, you will learn what the goal of the farmer really is. And sometimes he thinks he has to go for a low calving interval, but maybe it's more interesting, of course, to focus on a pregnancy rate and an insemination rate as a better KPI. If you look at KPIs, we can split them actually into three. You could make key performance indicators as you can use it as a feedback KPI. I will show some details later, I'll give you some examples, but feedback KPI will tell you what has happened the last maybe month, last year. Would show you an example immediately. Another KPI of KPI is a process indicator. It could work as a process indicator, and that is a KPI that will tell you what is happening now or during this period. This month, what is happening now on conception rate, for example, is a process indicator. And a third kind of KPI is a KPI that we call them feed-forward KPIs, and those KPIs are actually more trying to predict. You could learn something, what will happen in the future, what will probably happen. Looking at this KPI, what can we expect in the future? So it depends on your goals, depends on on the farm which KPI you can use. To give you some example, a typical feedback KPI on a farm is actually culling analysis. So if you look at culling rate, it only tells you something on what has happened. So many cows has left, are sold, or are died during a certain period. So the problem has actually already gone. The problem was in the past, and now we are looking at a figure that is telling you what has happened in the past. So culling rate is a typical feedback KPI. If you talk about the process indicator, what is happening now, which event, how it is going now. For example, if you look at the somatic cell count analysis, here you can see every time 4.1. If you go to the consultant version where you can find this graph. If you look at new infection rates, which is a good KPI to work on, I think. This one is actually a real process indicator because it measures, it shows you how many new infections were at the moment of measuring. So the moment of measuring is the milk control in this case. And for example, this 31 of July, we had a new infection rate of 13%.2. So this is really measuring the process at the moment you're looking at. It's not predicting. Maybe it can predict something, but it's not really predicting. It's really telling you what is happening now. Another process indicator, for example, can be conception rate. Conception rate is really telling you in a certain period how many cows are pregnant during this. In this case, we're looking at a month, for example, in August, conception rate was really low. So all insemination over there, we had low chances to get pregnant. It's also telling you something at the process, for example, insemination technique, maybe also on weather you can choose, but it will tell you something how the process at that moment is going. It will not tell you how it was the year before. It's not looking in the past, it's not even looking in the future. It's looking in a certain period how it is. How the process really is going at that moment. The third type of KPI is the feed-forward KPI. And that's also an interesting analysis, in my opinion, is 3.3. If you look at the freshening pattern, and there you could also go to properties, right side, you select properties, and then you could go to the prediction only and only showing the pregnant cows, which means that only the cows that are really diagnosed as pregnant, there you can click on, and then you will see only cows and young stock that are really diagnosed as pregnant that will calve in a certain month. And that's, in my opinion, really interesting because it's predicting something. It is telling you what will happen in the future. For example, in May, I see it's in Dutch, the months are in Dutch, but Zoom everybody can understand. So here you have second bar is May. In May, we think we will have 10 calvings. If you then look a couple months later, August, September, summertime, we will increase our calvings to 30, even 40 calvings per month. Which means it can tell you, okay, if we are limited space on dry cow in transition, we know in May it's going to be easy. It's not going to be a big issue to have a lot of stress in the transition barn. But maybe in August and September, also with the same limited space, probably, and a lot of farms we see it. It's limited space in transition barns, and then you could actually predict that it will be more difficult to achieve the same goals, to have as less metabolic diseases as we have in May. So this is a KPI that will really predict something, and you could use it to change your management in that period. Okay. And there are also some KPIs that actually tell something, give information on two sides. For example, really also interesting, of course, is body condition. If you look at the body condition analysis or look at body condition score itself, it will always look back to what has happened. Most of the time, the last month, what is the condition, what is the energy balance of the last month, looking at cows that are really top of lactation, and you see most of the time cows that are more skinny, have a lower condition score, so it will tell you how was the negative energy balance the last month. So it's actually feedback. We're looking back into the past. But you could turn it the other way around also, looking at body condition score on cows that around calving and cows that have a high condition score. It will also tell you, it will help predicting the incidence rate of metabolic disease. Knowing that if you have a lot of cows more than, let's say, 4.0 body condition score, you probably will have some more issues with calvings, with postpartum diseases in general. So in that case, this KPI is actually both. It's looking back and it's also looking forward to give you some information. Another interesting tool that is also in the consultant version is actually that you could look at data in two ways. You could look at it as a cohort study, and you could also look at it as a cross-sectional study. We'll show the examples in a minute. If you look at cows in a cohort study, you're actually looking at a group of cows, for example, that are exposed to, it can be dry cow ration, for example, or are exposed to a disease in the past, and also an exposure, or inseminated or calved in a certain period. Those are exposed, and those are unexposed. They are, for example, calved in another period, or which was not confounded with heat stress, for example. And then, so the event is happening in the past, and then you follow up those animals in time, and that will depend on the KPI, the figure you're looking at. For example, if we look at conception rate, we can look at conception rates on cows, or also calving interval, for example. What is the calving interval from cows that are exposed or that has calved in a certain period? For example, in summertime, you compare it to cows that are unexposed, for example, they have calved in spring or in autumn, and you're looking on the same also on the calving interval. So actually you're looking at something that has happened in the past, and you follow those animals up, and later on you look at the data and see what's happening. It's interesting because there you could show more as a cause effect. Is summer affecting my conception rate, for example? Which you can see better in a cohort study. Most of the data you're looking at in general is actually data that you're looking at as the cross-sectional study, which means it just takes a snapshot in time. You're looking at how many, for example, this month, all cows inseminated in a certain period, what is the conception rate, and you can subdivide those cows as exposed or unexposed. It can also be exposed to a risk factor. A risk factor can also be the guy that inseminated the cow, or the bull you're using. It's also exposed to a certain bull or not exposed. But then you're only looking at the moment they are, in that time, the moment they are inseminated. But just cross-sectional. It's more difficult to interpret this as cause effect in the cross-sectional study. That's why cohort studies are more interesting. But of course, since the snapshot in time is really quick, because now you're taking a snapshot, as the word it said, it goes quick, so it could really help you already, depending on what you are measuring. Compared to the cohort study, you need some time to give a good explanation, give a good interpretation to it. In UNIFORM-Agri, there are the same fertility analysis actually are available in those two ways. For example, there's the let's say that the regular one is a cross-sectional study, is just looking at how the cows we are inseminating this month, what is the result on conception, what is the days in milk in this month, what is the calving interval in this month, all the cows we have inseminated in that period. And that period can be, you could play with it, the period can be months, the last trimester, the last year. But you can also look at the same data, the same KPIs actually as a cohort study. And the cohort here in UNIFORM-Agri is actually the calving group. So cows that have calved in a certain period, and also that period you could change, and you could put it on the calved in a month, calved in the last trimester, or in this year. They have a certain KPI later on. So what I will show it later in the pitfalls, or we talk about pitfalls, which is the next topic. I will show you some advantages of looking at cohort study or cross-sectional study. So the last points, which are split up in different points, are some pitfalls that I would like to share with you that are maybe good to know. Some of them, of course, you are already aware of, but I think it was good in the scope of this afternoon that I will show you some things that probably can help you in interpretation of the data. First of all, if I go to a farm and I look at the data, I want to know how good the data is. What is all the data that I want to see, is it actually correct? And in that way, if you go to the fertility analysis 3.1, the lowest bar, you could see suspicious data. If you go, and here it's in blue, and if you look at the suspicious data, actually in the best farm where all data is correct, it should be 0, but there are always some small issues, probably some small issues on a farm, and that can have an effect on the interpretation of the data. So here, if you see in this year 2021, actually the barn has expanded a lot. They have bought a whole new other stable on this farm, and you can see it adds up the number of suspicious data. So in that, you have to be a little bit more careful in interpretation of the data in that year. The year after 2022, you could see there's only one suspicious data. You can click on it and on the I button, and it's always interesting to show it to the farmer and to ask questions on why is this animal actually suspicious. It's also mentioned, if you click on it, it's also mentioned what is probably has gone wrong. Sometimes it's calving data that we don't have, or a suspicious calving. So that's always interesting to look for the first time. The other thing that's also good to check is the voluntary waiting period. It's interesting. Why? Because of course conception rates, actually insemination rate, is based on the voluntary waiting period, so it will change as long as you change your voluntary waiting period. Also, insemination rate will change. So it's good to have the voluntary waiting period as it is on that farm. So it can and it will change between farms, and most of the time it will not change on a farm, but sometimes. But here, for example, on this farm, it was entered that it was 60 days, the voluntary waiting period, but actually in that year, the true voluntary waiting period on that farm was 78 days. So it has to be correct voluntary waiting period, otherwise your calculations they're not wrong, but you can misinterpret them if you look at it. Another one, which can be sometimes useful, sometimes not. Suspicious data, which I see very often, is quite common in our region also, that our farms don't have any mastitis cases. It's really strange actually to be the most costly infectious disease in the whole world, and nobody has it. Of course, these are herds that don't put the mastitis cases into the program, which is actually a bit pity, because there are a lot of analysis also available in the system that you can work on. Sometimes I show it to the farmer just to let him see what the program can do, and I ask him, why are you not entering your data? Because if you enter this data, we can learn from it. And it can also motivate some farmers if they know if you're going to use the data in your work, in your consultancy work. If they know you're going to use it, then they are more prone to, they will more willing to enter it also in the program. It's quite the logic. Why do they need to enter it if nobody uses it? They won't do it. They have a lot of work, other work to do. So sometimes it's interesting to even show an empty graph to explain what is the goal of the farmer, and if his goal is limiting or decreasing mastitis cases, then he should start, of course, with entering those data in the system. Another thing, especially on small herds, but even on herds with 100 cows, 150 cows, if you look at the KPI, you should also check always, do we have enough cows to give it a good interpretation? And it's mentioned by Alex Bach, has used it often as an example. I just used his example here in this presentation. If you look at conception rate, actually, of course, if you look at proportions, it's interesting to use proportions, but every proportion is there's a denominator. Of course, it's measured, it's calculated on how many cows, and to be correct, to give it a good interpretation, conception rate and insemination rate, actually you have to have at least 50 animals in the denominator, which for conception rates and on small herds, if you look at herds even with 100 cows, if you need at least 50 cows in the denominator, it will take some time. It will take a couple of months to have that and to give it the right interpretation. So always be careful. The good thing, if you look at the slide, if you look at the UNIFORM-Agri console, at the figures, at the tables, it's always mentioned on how many cows that the data is measured, that the percentage is measured. So it's good that it is available, so you can, it will help you to evaluate the figures on the right way. Also, culling data, you should be aware that it's always difficult for a farmer if he gives up some reasons. Here on the right hand, you can see the top 8 culling reasons for the dairy cows. See under it, it's in Dutch, but everybody knows most of the time it's milk production, fertility, broken leg, reproduction. But it's not always. Most of the time, farmers gives actually the last reason why the cow has really left the herd, and it's sometimes the last reason. But sometimes cows are not pregnant because they have had a problem during transition. So it's always good to be aware that actually the real reason, most of the times farmers, they really know, they know the story of those cows. It's good to help them a little bit and to ask for, not strictly using the reasons. I'll go back a little bit. I'll just go to the same slide. Always interesting if you look at if there's enough data. Also on culling data, it's always interesting to look at cows that has had the label of do not breed. If they are, because if all the cows are not mentioned in the program as some cows are mentioned as do not breed, it will the conception rate, for example, insemination rate will be different if you compare it to a herd where there aren't any cows that have the status as do not breed. So it has also have a real big impact on fertility analysis. Then some other pitfalls, and I think it's really important to talk about this one. That is, if if you use averages, and everybody is using averages in the daily life, it can be very dangerous. It will depend on variation, of course. Here I can see a small graph, theoretical graph actually, showing how many cows are there present on that herd with a certain calving interval. You can see if you look at the average calving interval in this graph is 405 days, which gives you a good impression of what the exact, or what the biggest proportion of the herds, of the cows in the herd have as a calving interval. But it's always better to use median or proportion. And why? Because most of the time, especially on small herds, some data is not normally distributed. For example, here, this is real data on a farm. Here you can see the same average, 405 days, to an average calving interval, but as you can see, you're looking at different herds. Here you can see there are a lot of cows that had achieved a really short calving interval, but the average is summed up a little bit, has increased, just because there are some cows, 6 cows, that have a calving interval above 450 days. And those cows are actually increasing the average of the calving interval. And that's always dangerous if you only look at those averages. So it's more interesting to look at proportions, to look at the median, which tells you which is the number where half of the animals are beneath and the other half are above this figure. And that will tell you more sometimes if the data is not normally distributed. More information on the herd than only looking at averages. And actually, for every KPI, you should be capable, or you should know if this is normally distributed or not. Like calving interval, days in lactation. This is a graph actually on the right hand side. You can see a graph on the days in lactation. You can see a little bit Gauss curve. It tends to be a normal distribution, but still on that farm there are quite a lot of cows beginning of lactation. So if you work on that herd with average days in lactation, it's not really saying the truth. Also, cell count, normal cell count, is really a difficult one. Well, it's not difficult, it's really a typical KPI that is not normally distributed. So using an average cell count does not tell you, does not give you a lot of information. Daily milk yield, most of the time, it can be normally distributed, but it's not always the case. So if you use averages, look at the distribution on that herd. And you can do it also in the UNIFORM program. For example, if you look at the fertility analysis, here I've had an example on the expected calving age on heifers, and you see in 2022 on this farm it was 24 months, 0.4. Well, the average expected calving age, if you click on it, a new window will pop open, and then you could use the slicer to put it. If you put it right in the middle, you're actually looking at the median, and here also the median is 24 months. Then you know probably this is quite normally distributed. There's not a lot of heifers here in this case that are really low, or not a lot of heifers that are really high in calving age, and that can be different. For example, the same analysis, but if you look at the expected calving interval, looking at the same year, you can see on average it was 426 days in milk. But looking at the median, if you check the median, you end up at 409 days in milk. So here there's really a big effect. Probably for some cows that you could slice through them, you can look for those cows that really have a high impact on the average. So look at the distribution of the data. Another way to look at distribution of data is looking at the scatter plot, and there are numerous scatter plots in the program. There you can see if variation plays a role or not. In this case, for example, On this farm, you see there's really a strict protocol in starting to inseminate and a strict protocol when he has all cows inseminated at a certain on certain days in milk. So it's you can also read the goal and the attitude of the farmer. If you see this farm, if you compare to the other slide here, you can see that there's really there was some protocol during some months and there was no protocol during other months. This is actually a farm with father and son in charge, and they disagree on when do we start inseminating which cow, and sometimes the son he tended to start to inseminate at very quite early, 50 days, something like that, and the father, he's really convinced that you have to wait 150 days to start to inseminate, and that's here you can see a big variation. So that's the advantage of using scatter plots to look at variation. Also, looking at variation, don't look at averages, especially not on somatic cell count. Okay, when an average is low, you're quite sure that there's not a big problem if you talk about other health. But if you look at proportions, it could tell you more. For example, here you can see an average of more than 300 cells, 300,000 cells in actually in the bulk tank, because it's a herd average. It's a weighted for yield per test, and there you can see actually the last months, September, October, November, there's an increase in the herd in the bulk somatic cell count, calculated bulk somatic cell count, but actually if you look at the proportion of cows that are above a certain level, here 200,000 or 400,000 cells, is actually decreasing. So, for example, in the month of which is shown in red, in the month of November, you can see an increase in cell count on the herd level, but actually he's doing better because he has fewer cows with a high somatic cell count. So if you don't look always at the averages, if you can use proportions. And there's another one. You can go into this more deeply, splitting up all somatic cell counts as new infections or cured, chronic, or healthy cows. So it's always better to look at proportions than to look at the average cell count. Also looking at milk production, the variation in milk production, we could have a look at milk production, but really interesting tool, interesting KPI, in my opinion, and we are in the Benelux, in Belgium and in the Netherlands, we're used to it. In Belgium and the Netherlands, it is called BSK. In English, it's called SPP, and it stands for Standard Peak Production. And why is it a good KPI? Because it is milk production, but it's corrected for age, it's corrected for the time of pregnancy, and it's corrected for the days in lactation, which means that actually it is really influenced by management. Your milk production, and if you look at that figure, is not really influenced by age. We know that a heifer is giving more milk, will give less milk than an older cow. While if you look at the SPP, actually SPP should be the same for a heifer, and if you compare it to an older cow, because it's corrected for that. So it's really interesting tool also to look through the variation in milk production. Of course, on large herds, it is maybe sometimes, it's also interesting, but it's especially interesting SPP on small herds. And if I talk about small herds, I would say less than 200 cows is quite small. And then you will see a really big advantage on using SPP. For example, this herd, it's a really interesting graph, 2.13 milk production graph. And if you're looking at the average milk production per group, and the groups are made as days in milk, then you can see it's quite logic that cows are in green, for example, they are above 300 days in milk, they will give less milk than a cow at the beginning of lactation. But how many less? How many liters should they give less to to evaluate them as a group that has performed well. And that's really difficult to, if you look at the milk production. If you look at SPP, that actually it is calculated, it's corrected for that difference. So normally an SPP should be the same for groups beginning of lactation and the end of lactation. If it's not the same, that something has happened. There's a problem, or something is getting better in one group compared to another group. For example, in this on this farm, you can see that the freshening group is not doing well, almost not during the whole year. It was not really visible. If I go back to the first slide, it's not really visible. Maybe you could see that during summer the red line is not doing a good job. But looking at SPP, it is much more clear to evaluate these herds. Another pitfall that can be, and I think this one, and then we have one or two less, and then we are done. Today's problem or today's solution is not always seen directly, and we call it lag. So it means that actually what is lag? It's a period between the moment an event occurs and the moment it is measured. For example, and I'm glad that there are a lot of people that don't use calving interval. If you use calving interval, yeah, it will not have, if you have a recent reproductive problem and you don't get your cows pregnant, it will not have an effect on your calving interval. The other way around, it's not because you have a high calving interval today that you have problems today in getting cows pregnant. No, having a high calving interval only tells you something on what has happened 8 to 9 months ago. So there's a lag in between those things. Another example, for example, is udder health. If you change your hygiene in the young stock barn, and you improve it a little bit just to have less new infections, less CNS, for example, after calving, well, then you have to wait to monitor it, and it will only be visual or measurable if you look at the first somatic cell count after calving. So it can take, there's a lag of 1 year, 1.5 years in between the moment the event occurs, so the infection, for example, in the young stock barn, and the moment you can measure it. So if you talk about goals, if you talk about setting and monitoring, you have to be aware that there's always it's possible that there's a lag in between those two things. And for example, also drying off. If you look at the dry off results, if you change to a new protocol for drying off cows, for improving cure rates at drying off, for example, and then you have to wait all the time until the next milk test date has shown up. So it will take at least 2 to 3 months to give the first evaluation of the first cows that have had a different dry off protocol. Something else also has mentioned a little bit, but it's called momentum. And what do we mean with momentum? It's meant that the historical data will mask actual performance. I'll give you a quick example. It's really very theoretically, I'm aware of that, but it's just to show how dangerous it can be if you're looking at the wrong KPI. So let's say you have a 100 cow herd, of which of the 100 cows, 10 cows have freshened the last 30 days, so are less than 30 days in milk. And those cows, those 10 cows, they give 35 liters a day, and the other 90 cows, they give 25 liters a day. So how many liters of milk do we have? On average, in total, we have 2,600 liters per day, and on average, you will have 26 liters per cow per day. Let's say that we will change the dry cow ration, give some additives or change some management. It's just an example, and we think with the goal of improving the beginning of lactation, and we want to improve with 2 liters of milk. If we do that, if we start with this, those 10 cows, after they have had the dry cow ration and they started, they freshened, and okay, it worked. Our measurement was working, and we have 37 liters of milk per day. But the other 90 cows, they are not, they have not had the additive, of course. They stay at 25 liters of milk per day. If you then look at the average, so the whole herd average, it will only increase with 200 milliliters a day. So you will not see it on your farm. If you see an increase of milk production, you will not see it really on your farm, because only the 10 cows have an effect on the whole herd average. So in this case, actually, to evaluate it in a good way, you have to wait for 1 year to see the whole herd improving, and then you will have 28 liters. But even then, after 1 year, everybody knows that there will be some other things that will happen. So it's always difficult if you look at the KPI, which is a bulk actually of different cows, and there's a lag and a momentum in place. It's difficult to give it a good interpretation. How can you handle it? You could try to evaluate the period with the most recent data. For example, if you change something, you could look only at the freshening group. That's why in this graph it's interesting to split the milk production graph into cows that has freshened or later in lactation, and you look at this group, and you don't look at the milk production, but you look at SPP. So you look at the standard peak production. Here in this example, you can see if we change something on half of February, you can see an improvement of the cows that are in the beginning of lactation, and then they're actually going together on the same line almost as the other group, which means that they are actually improving in the same way we think they should improve. And the beginning of February, that was more difficult. There you can see there's a big gap between the freshening group and all the other cows, which means that actually they are underperforming in the beginning of lactation. So which animals are included? Bias, I think we're almost done. I see I am more than 3 hours, so more than a couple of minutes too late, but okay. I would say hang on for a couple of minutes. There's also something that's called bias, and then you should be aware for every KPI which animals are included in this KPI or which one are not are excluded in this KPI. For example, typical one, and that's especially also one reason that calving interval is not really a good KPI. What do we do with culled cows? Culled cows are not, they didn't get pregnant, so they don't have a calving interval. So looking at calving interval itself does not tell you the whole story. And you have to be aware what has happened with culled cows. How many culled cows do we have? The same as I already mentioned, if you look at conception rate, animals do not breed. Are they mentioned actually? If you look at the herd fertility status, give a quick look what is happening on the farm. If you don't see any cow with this black label as do not breed, all cows are breeded or trying to be inseminated. Most of the time it's not correct. Almost all farms, they should have some black cows labeled as a black cow as do not breed, because that will have an effect on your conception rate and will have an effect on your insemination rate. So if not, you could to be careful in interpretation with this. Then I'll go to this quite fast. Dry period length. You could also look at risk factors. This is a graph that I use many times because it tells me something on the management style of the farmer. This is the days they are dried off, cows are dried off. You can also check for their cell count and what has happened during drying off. But nevertheless, you can always see the days they are dried off in general. And here on this farm, you can see, if you look at all lactations, and that's where I want to go to, if you could select all the time in here and all lactations, or you look only at the second lactation, and here you can see, so those are heifers that has been dried off for the first time. here on this farm, almost every heifer has a very short dry period, which most of the time is maybe not so bad for metabolic disease, but I see often that those heifers will not, as a second lactation cow, will not perform very well. Because they don't have had a good dry period. But here you can see this is different. If you look at the cows with 3 lactations and more, those drying off period here is really, there's a big variation. There are also cows that have had a dry period length which is quite small, but on the other way around, you can see there are quite a lot of cows that really have 80 days, 100 days dry off. So here there are different risk factors that are playing a role, and also as a predicting KPI, you will see that, okay, those cows with a big dry period length are more prone to have metabolic diseases. And it's different if you look at the second lactation cows, because there you can see all cows were actually have had a short dry period length. You can also you could check for risk factors for example, here on pregnancy rate, and you could filter, you could use a filter and using some typical aspects. For example, here in this example, it's interesting if you have milk control, you could check for the ratio, so select actually only the cows with a low fat protein ratio, which are suspicious of having had more acidosis. You could also check the normal group with a normal fat protein ratio, or you could select the group and look at the data of which they had a high fat protein. So those are the cows that are suspicious for a big negative energy balance. I know fat protein is not, it's a proxy, it's not the best way to show the negative energy balance, but it's the best thing you could have, and it's automatically done. It's always in the program. So I sometimes use this to show the farmer what is the impact of metabolic disease, of everything that it's going around calving. What is the impact on pregnancy rate? For example, in this, if you look at this graph of this figure, you can see pregnancy rates for the low cows, so suspicious of acidosis. You could see 50% insemination rate and 13% pregnancy rate in general. Maybe we could focus on the pregnancy rate only. We have 13 pregnancy rate for low fat protein. If you then go to normal fat protein levels in that herd, it will increase from 13 to 20%. The same herd, same farmer, same inseminator. And if you go to high fat protein, so those are cows probably that had more metabolic issues, it's also much lower than the 20% of the normal cows. So showing that to farmers can help them to convince them to change something or to focus on another aspect on their herd. Sometimes those people are only focusing on, let's say, the protocol of insemination, but on this herd they have to focus on transition if they want to improve their fertility. And you could play with it a little bit in this filter, also with lactation length, numbers of lactation and whatever, and they could check for the pregnancy rates. But that was actually my talk this afternoon. So to conclude, I would just tell you, so if you want to do some herd health and fertility consultancy, keep in mind that you have to use your management cycle. It's not that you have to show it them theoretically, but use it as looking at collecting data, making a plan, try to convince the farmer, know your farmer, and then set up a really good monitoring system using the good KPIs, and know from every KPI you have to know that there are some pitfalls, so there are always some advantages and there are always some drawbacks using a KPI, but just by knowing them, it's okay. You can learn to work with it, And if you evaluate, also, of course, try to do the reasoning. As that's the advantage of working with cows, or especially as a veterinarian, you have to be aware of the physiology of the cow and use that in explaining what you see on the farm. And with that, I will take any questions if you have one. So if there are any questions, I think you could put it in the chat box, and then they will ask to be asked to me.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Peter, can you hear me? Yes, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we have some questions. Jan, I don't know if you want to start with them. No, he's unmuted. Okay, then I will start with them. Okay, so Peter, do you evaluate the conception rate of insemination bulls or service bulls, and how do you do that?
Actually, on our herds, I don't do this because you don't have enough of cows or used semen per cow to have a good evaluation. So what I often do is you could use it also in UNIFORM-Agri is check if they are using sex semen or not, but I don't look at the bull I used to change to another bull, for example. Maybe on herds that are using the same bull for years and years. Most of the time it's not the case, but big herds, sometimes they're using a bull for 2 or 3 years on certain cows. Then sometimes it could be useful, but in general, I don't do it. But I think you have to do it more on the whole group. If you take different farms together, then maybe you will have an impression, but not on the farm level. I find it quite risky to do it.
Okay, thank you. Another question. We have some more questions, but we are going to read only a few of them because it's already almost 3:15. So then we will share the email. It's not readable at all right now in your slide, Peter. I don't know if you can get out of the slide share mode so people can see your email and your contact details in case they want to contact you.
I will try to.
Just sharing the PowerPoint application. I think it will work.
Yeah, I think this should be more clear. Yeah.
Yes. So now people can see your mobile, email, and website. Thank you. Yeah, another question is, what do you advise farmers about dealing with heat stress?
Oh. That's difficult. Well, it's not difficult, but it will depend on the farm, of course. Looking at heat stress, I mainly focus actually on dry cows and transition barn. If they make an investment, I focus on sometimes I find it's a forgotten group. Most of the farmers, they buy ventilators and cooling systems for the lactating group, but there are a lot of scientific evidence now that actually cooling the dry cow group is more efficient, more beneficial than cooling lactating group. So I try to focus on that. And I think in general, ventilation and cooling down and shadow, giving shadow is number one. And then second, you can go and look for, especially then lactation, you can go to changes in duration. But number one would be the barn and ventilation, and especially dry cows. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Another one is, how do you determine the voluntary waiting period at a dairy farm? How do you decide that with the farmer?
Well, it's a nice question, because actually the name voluntary waiting period, in my opinion, is a little bit suspicious, because actually you don't have to wait during that period. You have to prepare your cows to be inseminated on a certain moment, and that moment is depending on farms, but in general we say we're inseminating cows at 45 days, 50 days. That's our starting point, and then afterwards you could check easily in UNIFORM-Agri what is the conception rate based on looking at the days the cows were in milk. You can look at conception rate. So, for example, there was an example here also in my presentation. They started inseminating very early at 30 days in milk. It was a choice of the farmer. After 2 years, we looked at the conception rate, how many cows are pregnant, of which they are inseminated for at between 30 days and 40 days, and it was very, very few. I think we only had 10% or 12% pregnant cows of that period, so then we skipped that period. So after 1 year, 1.5 years, you could look at the conception rates split up in when they are actually inseminated. But in general, we say 45, 50 days to start with.
Okay. Pretty similar to other places, I would say.
Hope so.
Okay, thank you. And last one, how often do you advise dairy farmers to score body condition?
Most of the farms, we do it ourselves, and we try to make it as, I think you have to look what you want to know with your body condition score, which are the critical periods. So which is a critical period, drying off is a critical period, dry cows all the time, calving, and the top of lactation. So actually those moments, those are for me the critical moments to have a scoring. So, and then it will depend how many times do you visit them, which group of cows do you take, do you select to score. But I'm interested in body condition score around drying off, around calving, and top of lactation. And most of the time, if you do herd health, if you do repro work, then actually, because you're just behind of the cow, you always take body condition score with you, because it takes no extra time to do it. And with that, you have actually some measurements during the whole lactation. But in general, you only need, in my opinion, three critical moments. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Peter. I think we can finish the session right now. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Yeah, well, thank you everybody to be on the other side, listening and sending all the questions and everything. Hope you have enjoyed. And please, if you need anything from Peter, you have the contact details there in the slide, so we will be happy to help you. Yeah. Okay, have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.